The mysterious tattoo. Marta's morning began like any other. The shrill buzz of her alarm clock at 6:30 a.m. pierced through the stillness of her small apartment. She groggily reached out from under the covers, fumbling to silence it, her fingers brushing against the coarse linen of her sheets. With a yawn, she rubbed her eyes and sat up. The pale winter sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting faint patterns on the wall. Another day, another routine. Still half asleep, she swung her legs out of bed, her feet brushing against the cool floor. Marta was a creature of habit. Her life was meticulously scheduled. Work at an insurance agency, occasional dinners with friends, and solitary evenings spent binge-watching whatever Netflix series was trending. It wasn't exciting, but it was comfortable, predictable, or so she thought. As she reached for her phone, something unusual caught her eye. On her left forearm, just below her wrist, was something that hadn't been there before. A tattoo. Marta froze, her pulse quickening as her brain scrambled to make sense of what she was seeing. It was a small, precise design, nothing elaborate or artistic. Just a simple sequence of numbers and letters, written in black ink, December 28, 2024, 14:15. Her initial reaction was disbelief. She touched it, her fingers running over the inked surface. The skin felt normal, smooth, unbroken, as if the tattoo had always been there. No redness, no swelling, no sign of healing. "What the hell?" she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. The tattoo looked fresh, immaculate, as if it had been etched into her skin with laser-like precision. But Marta had no memory of getting it. She didn't have tattoos, nor had she ever wanted one. Heart pounding, she rushed to the bathroom and flicked on the light, leaning close to the mirror. Under the harsh fluorescent glare, the tattoo looked even more unsettling. She rubbed it furiously with her fingers, then tried washing it off with soap and water. Nothing happened. Her mind raced. She hadn't gone out drinking. She hadn't attended any parties. In fact, the night before, she'd stayed home, watching a crime drama on Netflix and eating a Caesar salad she'd ordered from Uber Eats. There was no plausible explanation for the tattoo's sudden appearance. Grabbing her laptop, she began searching frantically online. Tattoo appearing overnight, she typed into Google, followed by mystery marks on skin. The results were unhelpful. Most articles suggested mundane causes like ink transfer or allergic reactions, but this was neither. Then there were the paranormal forums, where people claimed everything from alien abductions to time loops. Marta dismissed them all. She was a rational person, not one to believe in conspiracies or supernatural phenomena. But as the minutes ticked by, her unease deepened. She couldn't ignore the tattoo, no matter how much she wanted to. By mid-morning, she had managed to push it to the back of her mind. Work was a welcome distraction. Sitting at her cluttered desk in the corner of a drab office, she busied herself with client files and insurance policies. But every so often, her gaze would drift to her forearm, the numbers silently taunting her. As the clock approached 2 p.m., an inexplicable sense of anticipation began to build. Marta tried to dismiss it as paranoia. The tattoo couldn't possibly mean anything. It was just a bizarre coincidence. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. At 1:50 p.m., she grabbed her coat and told her supervisor she was stepping out for a late lunch. The crisp December air hit her face as she walked briskly through the crowded streets. The city was alive with holiday shoppers, their bags stuffed with last-minute gifts, their faces flushed from the cold. Marta's eyes scanned her surroundings, though she wasn't sure what she was looking for. And then, it happened. At exactly 2:15 p.m., as Marta crossed an intersection, a man on a bicycle came hurtling toward her. He swerved, trying to avoid her, but lost control and tumbled to the ground. The impact sent his bag flying, its contents scattering across the pavement. Marta acted on instinct. She knelt to help him, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. The man, a wiry figure in his 30s, nodded breathlessly. Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks." He gathered his belongings hurriedly, his hands trembling slightly. Then, as if remembering something, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small white envelope. "This is for you," he said, his tone strangely calm. Before Marta could respond, the man picked up his bicycle and disappeared into the crowd, leaving her holding the envelope. The paper felt heavy between her fingers. She tore it open, her curiosity overcoming her caution. Inside was a single silver key and a note that read, "Don't miss the 7 o'clock train." She stared at the note, her mind reeling. What train? What did this key open? And who was the man? The rest of the day passed in a haze. Marta returned to work, but her thoughts were consumed by the mysterious envelope. That evening, sitting in her dimly lit apartment, she turned the key over in her hands, examining its smooth surface. It looked ordinary, but the circumstances surrounding it were anything but. As the hours dragged on, her anxiety gave way to exhaustion. She decided to call it a night. But just before heading to bed, she glanced at her forearm one last time. Her breath caught in her throat. The tattoo had changed. The numbers had rearranged themselves, forming a new date and time. January 3rd, 2025, 11 a.m. When Marta woke up the next morning, the first thing she did was check her arm. She had hoped, prayed, even, that the tattoo would be gone, that it had been nothing more than a strange dream or a figment of her imagination. But the numbers were still there. January 3rd, 2025, 11 a.m. She stared at the new date and time, her heart sinking. The tattoo wasn't just a bizarre anomaly. It was changing, evolving. It wasn't a static mark but a living message, one that seemed to be guiding her toward something. Her thoughts drifted to the key and the note from the day before. She pulled the small envelope from her coat pocket and inspected the items once more. The key was plain, unremarkable, with no identifying marks to suggest what it might unlock. The note, though cryptic, felt charged with purpose. Don't miss the 7 o'clock train. She hadn't gone to the station the night before, too overwhelmed to act on the instruction. But now, with this new date etched into her skin, she realized she might not have a choice. Marta's day passed in a fog. She went through the motions at work, her fingers typing mindlessly on the keyboard while her mind raced. What would happen at 11 a.m. on January 3rd? And why her? Why had she been chosen? If that was even the right word. She spent the evening searching online again, this time using more specific terms. Changing tattoos, messages on skin, foretelling dates. She found stories about people with prophetic marks, but they all sounded like urban legends. None of them offered a plausible explanation. The night was restless. Her dreams were fragmented, filled with glowing clocks and endless corridors. She woke up at dawn, drenched in sweat, and stared at the ceiling for hours before dragging herself out of bed. The morning of January 3rd arrived with a strange heaviness, as if the air itself carried the weight of impending significance. At 10:30 a.m., Marta left her apartment. She didn't know where she was supposed to go, so she chose to wander the streets near the city center. The tattoo hadn't provided an address or any clues beyond the time, leaving her to rely on instinct. As the clock neared 11 o'clock, her pulse quickened. The bustling city seemed to slow down, each sound amplified. The hum of passing cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the rhythmic click of her boots on the pavement. At exactly 11 a.m., she found herself outside a small cafe tucked into the corner of a quiet street. The name of the cafe, Café Mirador, struck a chord in her memory, though she couldn't place it. Feeling a tug of curiosity, she stepped inside. The cafe was cozy, with warm lighting and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Marta glanced around, unsure of what she was looking for. Most of the tables were occupied by couples and solo diners immersed in their laptops or books. And then, it happened. A woman near the counter fumbled with her bag, spilling its contents onto the floor. Marta instinctively moved to help her. "Oh, thank you," the woman said, flustered. As Marta picked up a wallet and a small, antique pocket watch, Marta's fingers froze on the watch. It was old, its casing tarnished with age, but the design was unmistakable, a delicate engraving of intertwining vines on the back. She recognized it immediately. It was the same pocket watch her grandfather had carried, the one she'd lost years ago and never recovered. "This belonged to my grandfather," the woman explained, smiling. "He always said it was special, but I never understood why. It's been in our family for decades." Marta handed it back, her hands trembling slightly. The woman thanked her again and left the cafe, disappearing into the crowd outside. Marta stood frozen, staring after her. The encounter felt charged, like a piece of a puzzle sliding into place, though she couldn't yet see the bigger picture. She left the cafe shortly after, her thoughts racing. The tattoo had led her there, of that she was certain. But why? What connection did the pocket watch have to everything that was happening? Back home, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her forearm. The tattoo hadn't changed yet, but Marta knew it was only a matter of time. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're closer than you think. Don't lose the key." Her blood ran cold. Who was sending these messages? And how did they know about the key? She grabbed the small silver key from her desk and held it tightly in her hand, its cold surface grounding her amidst the chaos in her mind. The hours passed in tense silence. She couldn't focus on anything else, her thoughts circling back to the pocket watch, the tattoo, and the message. When night fell, she finally mustered the courage to go back to the cafe. It was closed, its lights dim, but something compelled her to linger outside. She circled the building, her eyes scanning the alleyways and windows for she didn't know what. Near the back entrance, she found a door she hadn't noticed earlier. It was old and weathered, with a small keyhole at its center. Her heart skipped a beat as she pulled the silver key from her pocket. The key slid into the lock smoothly. With a deep breath, she turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A faint glow emanated from below, pulsing softly like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Marta hesitated, fear battling with curiosity. Then, clutching the key tightly in her hand, she stepped inside. Marta stood at the top of the staircase, the dim glow from below casting flickering shadows on the narrow, stone walls. Her fingers gripped the cold metal railing as her heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what lay at the bottom of those stairs, but something compelled her to move forward. Every step echoed, the sound swallowed quickly by the dense air. The descent felt endless, and with each step, the glow intensified. It wasn't a harsh light, but rather a soft, pulsating illumination, as though it were alive. The air grew warmer, carrying a faint metallic scent that reminded her of old coins. Her pulse quickened as she reached the final step and found herself standing before a heavy, steel door. The door was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its surface was smooth, adorned with intricate engravings that shimmered faintly in the pulsating light. Strange symbols covered the door, their patterns twisting and shifting as though they were alive. At its center was a circular recess, just the right size for the key she carried. Marta hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to walk away from whatever she had stumbled into. But another part of her, the part that had been following the tattoo's strange commands, knew there was no turning back. With trembling hands, She inserted the silver key into the recess. The symbols on the door lit up, spreading outward like ripples on water. A low hum filled the space, resonating deep in her chest. Slowly, the door began to slide open, revealing a chamber bathed in soft, golden light. Marta stepped inside, her breath catching at the sight before her. The room was vast, its walls lined with gears, cogs, and clockwork mechanisms that moved in perfect harmony. It was like stepping into the heart of an enormous, living timepiece. At the center of the chamber was a raised platform, and atop it stood a massive structure resembling a mechanical clock. The clock was unlike any she had ever seen. It had no hands or numbers, only shifting symbols that rearranged themselves in rhythmic patterns. Around it hovered dozens of glowing spheres, each pulsating with light and showing faint, flickering images. Marta moved closer, drawn to the spheres, and realized they weren't just random lights. They were windows into different moments. One sphere showed her as a child, running through a field with her younger brother. Another displayed her wedding day, the look of joy on her husband's face as they exchanged vows. A third sphere flickered with a darker image, her mother, sitting alone in a hospital bed, the faint outline of Marta herself standing in the doorway, hesitating to enter. Her breath caught in her throat. "Welcome, Marta," a voice said, echoing through the chamber. She spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the room appeared empty. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The clock in the center began to hum louder, its symbols shifting faster. "You've been chosen," the voice continued, calm yet commanding. "You are the Nexus." Marta's brow furrowed. Nexus? What does that even mean? Chosen for what? The spheres around her began to glow brighter, their images shifting to scenes she didn't recognize. Cities she had never visited, people she had never met, choices she had never made. "You are the fulcrum," the voice said. "Every decision you've made, every path you've taken, has created ripples in the fabric of time. Some have strengthened the flow, others have weakened it. Now, the balance is tipping." Marta shook her head, stepping back from the glowing spheres. "This is insane. I didn't ask for any of this." The voice softened. "No one asks to be the Nexus, but your actions, your existence, have made you the focal point. The tattoo was merely a guide, a way to bring you here. Now you must decide." "Decide what?" Marta asked, her voice rising with frustration. The central clock emitted a blinding pulse of light, and suddenly, two massive gears on either side of the room began to turn. As they moved, a set of symbols appeared above each gear, glowing like neon signs. One gear displayed an image of her current life, a montage of scenes where she moved through her routines, her solitary evenings, her unremarkable days at work. It was a life of stability, safety, and predictability. The other gear showed something entirely different. It was chaotic, filled with images of her interacting with strangers, making choices that led to unforeseen consequences. Some moments were triumphant, helping a young boy avoid an accident, reuniting a lost family, but others were devastating. In one scene, she watched as a building collapsed, and though the details were unclear, she felt an inexplicable guilt. "These are the paths before you," the voice said. "You can restore balance by consolidating all the ripples into a single, stable timeline. But doing so will erase every anomaly, every moment you've touched beyond your own reality." Marta stared at the images, her mind reeling. "And if I don't?" The spheres dimmed slightly, and the voice grew solemn. "If you maintain the anomalies, the timelines will fracture further. Reality itself will destabilize. Lives, billions of lives, will be affected. Some will cease to exist entirely." Her knees felt weak, and she sank onto the platform, her head in her hands. The enormity of the choice overwhelmed her. How can I decide something like this? She whispered. You've already begun, the voice replied. The spheres shifted again, showing her the man on the bicycle, the woman in the cafe, the pocket watch. Each event had set off a chain reaction, rippling outward in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. Marta stood, her fists clenched. If I choose to restore balance, what happens to me? You will remain, the voice said. But the moments you've changed will never have happened. Your memories will be the only remnants of what was. Her heart ached at the thought. The moments she had altered, saving lives, creating connections, they would vanish, leaving behind a world that might never know what had been prevented. And if I let the anomalies stay? The voice paused. You will become part of the Nexus, living in all timelines simultaneously. But it is not a life you would recognize. You would exist without truly being. Marta closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought of the tattoo, the key, the cryptic messages. They had brought her here, to this impossible moment. With a deep breath, she reached for the central clock. Marta's hand hovered over the central clock, trembling as the symbols on its surface pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The room seemed to hold its breath, the quiet hum of the gears growing louder with each passing second. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to make a choice, yet the weight of it all pinned her in place. Her mind raced through the possibilities. To erase the anomalies and consolidate the timeline would mean undoing every ripple she'd caused. The woman in the cafe, the man on the bicycle, even the chain of events that had brought her here, gone, as if they had never existed. But to keep the anomalies would doom the world to instability, endless fractures rippling through existence until reality itself collapsed. She clenched her fists. I didn't ask for this, she whispered to no one in particular, her voice cracking under the strain. The Nexus is not chosen by intent, the voice replied, resonating through the chamber. It is shaped by action. Your life, your decisions, they have woven themselves into the fabric of time in ways no one could have predicted. But now you must decide. The glowing spheres around her intensified, showing fragmented glimpses of what could be. In one, she saw herself standing on a train platform, helping a young girl reunite with her mother. In another, she was running through a crumbling city, her face etched with fear and determination. And then there was a scene that froze her in place. Her apartment, empty and dark, with no trace of her existence. Her breath quickened as the voice spoke again. The Nexus carries the burden of possibility. Every thread you pull shifts the entire weave. There is no perfect outcome, only balance or chaos. Marta took a step back from the clock, her eyes darting between the two massive gears turning on either side of the room. On her left was the stable timeline, a life of monotony, where nothing extraordinary ever happened. On her right, the chaotic path, where every ripple brought uncertainty, danger, and the potential for great change. The choice seemed impossible. If she chose balance, she would lose the connection to the extraordinary moments she'd glimpsed, the lives she had touched in ways she couldn't fully understand. But if she embraced the chaos, she risked destroying the very fabric of reality. Her thoughts drifted to the tattoo on her arm, now faintly glowing in the chamber's golden light. The numbers had guided her here, marking moments she hadn't understood until they unfolded. Each one had been a puzzle piece, leading her to this point. She looked at the central clock, its shifting symbols reflecting her inner turmoil. What happens to me if I choose balance? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You will remain, the voice said, but the timeline will reset. The anomalies will cease to exist, and the events that brought you here will never have occurred. You will live a life untouched by the Nexus, unaware of what was. Marta's chest tightened at the thought. To forget everything, the people she'd helped, the paths she'd walked, felt like losing a part of herself. And if I choose chaos? The gears on the right turned faster, their glow intensifying. "You will become one with the Nexus," the voice replied. "You will exist across all timelines, in every possibility. But you will lose your individuality. You will no longer be Marta, but a fragment of the whole." Her hands shook as she weighed the options. She thought of the man on the bicycle, the woman in the cafe, the lives she had touched without even realizing it. Were those moments worth sacrificing for stability? Or were they the very essence of what made life meaningful? Marta closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The hum of the clock grew louder, as if urging her to act. When she opened her eyes, they were filled with determination. "I choose balance," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The central clock responded immediately, its symbols flaring with blinding light. The gears on the left slowed to a halt, their glow dimming to a soft amber. Around her, the spheres began to dissolve, their images fading into nothingness. The chamber shook as the mechanisms clicked into place, the hum reaching a crescendo before falling silent. Marta felt a wave of warmth wash over her, a strange sensation of both loss and relief. The tattoo on her arm glowed brightly for a moment before vanishing, leaving her skin unmarked. The golden light of the chamber began to dim, and the room itself seemed to dissolve. Marta closed her eyes as the world around her faded into darkness. When she opened them, she was back in her apartment. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, and the sound of birds chirping filled the air. Everything looked normal, as if the events of the past days had been nothing more than a dream. She sat up, glancing at her forearm. The tattoo was gone. Her skin was smooth, unblemished, as if it had never been there. For a moment, she felt a pang of loss. The memories of what had happened were already starting to slip away, like sand through her fingers. She tried to hold on to them, but they faded with each passing second, leaving only the faintest impressions behind. Marta got up and walked to the window, looking out at the familiar street below. People bustled about their day, unaware of the choice she had made. Her life would go on, unremarkable and ordinary, but she felt a strange sense of peace. As she turned away from the window, her eyes caught something on her desk, a small silver key. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. She didn't remember where it had come from or why it was there, but it felt significant, like a remnant of a dream she couldn't quite recall. Marta placed the key in a drawer and closed it, her mind already shifting to the tasks of the day. The past was gone, and the future stretched out before her, unwritten and full of possibilities. But as she left the room, a faint glow pulsed from within the drawer, and the sound of a distant clock echoed softly in the air. The interdimensional bus stop. David's mornings were governed by ritual. At exactly 7 a.m., the shrill alarm on his phone shattered the silence of his room, dragging him from the depths of sleep. His movements were mechanical as he rolled out of bed, grabbed his worn robe, and shuffled into the kitchen. The smell of coffee brewing in his Nespresso machine was a small comfort, a familiar anchor that steadied him before the day began. By 7:15, he was in the shower, letting the warm water wash away the last remnants of sleep. He always finished with enough time to dress, grab his bag, and leave the apartment by 7:30. His destination was the same every day, a small, weathered bus stop at the corner of 4th and Maple, where he would wait for the 7:45 bus to take him to university. The bus stop was unremarkable, a simple shelter with a faded timetable posted on the side. Next to it, a sprawling oak tree stood guard, its gnarled roots breaking through the pavement and pushing up the nearby sidewalk. David liked the tree. It had an air of permanence that contrasted with the ever-changing chaos of the city. At 7:43, the bus would usually round the corner, its brakes hissing as it slowed to a stop. David would board, swipe his transit card against the reader, and find his usual seat near the middle, next to a slightly scratched window. From there, he could watch the city slide past in a blur of motion. Shop fronts, office buildings, traffic lights blinking rhythmically in red and green. That morning, everything followed the same script, at least at first. He arrived at the bus stop, stood under the shade of the oak tree, and checked his phone for messages while waiting. A cool breeze rustled the leaves above, carrying with it the faint aroma of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery. It was an ordinary morning, but at 7:45, the bus that arrived wasn't the one he was expecting. David looked up as the vehicle approached, his brow furrowing. It was the same route number, the same basic shape and size, but something about it was off. The paint on the side was slightly different, with an unfamiliar logo in a font he didn't recognize. The windows were tinted darker than usual, and the digital route display on the front flickered erratically before settling into a glowing blue. Must be a new model, David muttered to himself, though the explanation didn't feel convincing. The doors hissed open, and he stepped inside. The driver, an older man with a blank expression, didn't acknowledge him. David swiped his card and made his way down the aisle. The interior of the bus was stranger still. The seats were arranged in the usual rows, but the upholstery was sleek and metallic, reflecting the dim overhead lights. The ads that lined the walls were for brands he had never heard of: Netsphere Connectivity, SolarStream Energy, Eterna Motors. Their taglines were written in perfect English, yet the words felt alien, as though they didn't belong to his world. He chose a seat near the middle, as he always did, and stared out the window. The bus pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into traffic. At first, the cityscape looked familiar. Rows of brick buildings, small shops with colorful awnings, pedestrians crossing the street in their hurried morning routines. But as the bus continued its journey, David began to notice changes. The buildings grew taller, their facades covered in sleek, mirrored glass that reflected the morning sunlight. Billboards hovered in midair, their images shifting seamlessly between advertisements for products he couldn't name. The people on the sidewalks were dressed differently too, their clothes adorned with subtle metallic accents that glinted as they moved. "Where the hell am I?" David muttered under his breath. The realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't his city, not exactly. It looked like a version of it, but altered in ways he couldn't explain. A flicker of unease crept up his spine as he glanced around at the other passengers. They didn't seem to notice anything unusual. Most were absorbed in their phones or tablets, their faces bathed in the cold glow of their screens. David turned back to the window, his mind racing. He had been taking the same bus route for years. It was a straight shot to the university with no detours. Yet now, the streets outside looked unfamiliar, almost futuristic. At the next stop, a handful of passengers got off, replaced by others who boarded in silence. Among them was a man wearing a long coat, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The man's eyes scanned the bus as he entered, lingering briefly on David before he took a seat near the back. David's stomach tightened. Something about the man felt wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the way he moved, the way he carried himself, seemed out of place. The bus continued its journey, turning down streets that David had never seen before. The city outside grew stranger with each passing block. At one intersection, he saw a fountain that defied gravity, water spiraling upward in shimmering arcs. At another, a row of streetlights emitted soft, multicolored glows that shifted in rhythm with the foot traffic below. By the time the bus reached what should have been the university stop, David knew he was no longer in the world he recognized. The bus came to a halt, its brakes hissing as the doors slid open. A robotic voice announced the stop, but the words were distorted, garbled, as though spoken in a language he almost understood. David hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay on the bus, to avoid stepping into this strange, alien version of his city. But the passengers around him began to rise, moving toward the exit without hesitation. If he stayed behind, he'd draw attention to himself. Swallowing his fear, David stood and followed the others out. The air outside was crisp and clean, yet it carried an unfamiliar scent, something metallic, almost electric. The streets were lined with towering skyscrapers that seemed to pulse with light, their surfaces alive with shifting patterns. Above, the sky was a pale shade of blue-green, dotted with clouds that moved unnaturally fast. David stood on the sidewalk, his bag slung over one shoulder as the bus pulled away. He turned in a slow circle, taking in his surroundings. Everywhere he looked, the world seemed to hum with energy, as if it were alive. He glanced at his phone, hoping to find some clue about where he was. But the screen displayed only static, the usual icons replaced by flickering symbols he couldn't decipher. A chill ran down his spine. He was alone in a world he didn't recognize, with no way to contact anyone for help. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man from the bus, the one with the hat. He was standing across the street, watching him intently. David's heart pounded as his eyes locked on the man across the street. The figure in the long coat and hat stood motionless, his face obscured by the shadow of his brim. He didn't wave or call out. He simply stared, unblinking, like a predator sizing up its prey. David turned away, his mind racing. He needed to think, to figure out what was happening. This couldn't be real. Maybe he'd fallen asleep on the bus, and this was just some vivid dream conjured by an overactive imagination. Yet everything felt too sharp, too tangible. The cool air brushing his skin, the faint hum of energy in the ground beneath his feet. He glanced over his shoulder, but the man was gone. A shiver ran down his spine. He needed answers, and the only way to find them was to keep moving. The streets were bustling with activity, yet everything about the scene felt surreal. The people walked with purpose, their faces neutral and expressionless. Many wore sleek devices on their wrists that projected glowing holographic screens into the air, their fingers swiping and tapping at invisible controls. Some rode vehicles that hovered silently above the ground, their surfaces smooth and featureless, as if they were grown rather than built. David approached a corner where a kiosk displayed what appeared to be a map. The words and symbols on the map were almost comprehensible, like a language he should know but didn't. The locations were marked with names like Sector Nexus and Temporal Gate 17, none of which existed in the city he knew. "What the hell is this place?" he whispered, his voice lost in the crowd. He pulled out his phone, hoping it might offer some clue, but the screen was still filled with static. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the area for anything familiar. That's when he noticed the building. It was a towering structure of glass and metal, its surface alive with shifting patterns of light. At first glance, it looked like a modern office building, but as he focused on it, he realized the patterns weren't just decorative. They were images, moving scenes that seemed to loop endlessly. One panel showed a city collapsing into rubble, while another displayed a lush forest overtaking a series of abandoned skyscrapers. Above the entrance, a glowing sign read, "Temporal Transit Authority." David's instinct screamed at him to stay away, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. If this was some kind of government building, it might hold the answers he desperately needed. He crossed the street and approached the entrance, the glass doors sliding open with a soft hiss as he stepped inside. The interior was cavernous, its walls lined with monitors displaying streams of data. People moved briskly through the space, dressed in uniforms of muted gray with metallic accents. Their faces were unreadable, focused entirely on the tasks at hand. David felt a wave of unease. No one seemed to notice him, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He moved cautiously through the lobby, keeping his head down as he tried to blend in. Near the center of the room, a massive holographic display projected a map of the city, or at least a version of it. The map was layered with glowing pathways and symbols, each labeled with words he couldn't understand. He noticed a group of people gathered around the display, their attention fixed on a man who appeared to be giving instructions. David edged closer, straining to hear their conversation. Increased instability in Sector Delta, the man was saying, his voice calm but authoritative. We've detected a new anomaly near Gate 12. Prepare a team for immediate containment. David's stomach twisted. Anomaly. Containment. The words sent a chill through him, though he couldn't fully grasp their meaning. He backed away, careful not to draw attention to himself, and slipped through a side door into a narrow corridor. The hallway was lined with numbered doors, each one identical in design. He passed by them quickly, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. At the end of the corridor, he found a small room that appeared to be empty. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, leaning against it as he tried to catch his breath. The room was dimly lit, with a single terminal set into the wall. The screen flickered to life as he approached, displaying a message in glowing text. Access restricted. Please verify identity. David hesitated, unsure of what to do. He reached out and touched the screen, half expecting it to reject him outright. Instead, the text changed. Identity unregistered. Temporal nexus detected. His pulse quickened. Nexus? That was the second time he'd heard the word. What did it mean? Before he could process the message, the screen displayed a new prompt. Do you wish to proceed? Y/N. David's finger hovered over the screen. He didn't know what would happen if he pressed Y, but he felt as though he had no other choice. With a deep breath, he tapped the letter. The terminal emitted a low hum, and the wall beside it slid open, revealing another corridor bathed in dim, blue light. David stepped inside, his heart pounding as the door closed behind him. The corridor led to a small chamber filled with what looked like glass pods. Each pod glowed faintly, and inside them were people. David's breath caught in his throat. The figures inside the pods appeared to be asleep, their faces peaceful as they floated in a strange, viscous liquid. Small monitors next to each pod displayed streams of data, though the symbols were as incomprehensible as everything else in this world. He moved closer to one of the pods, his eyes widening as he realized the figure inside looked familiar. Too familiar. It was him. David stumbled back, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The man in the pod was identical to him in every way. Same face, same build, even the same expression he'd seen in the mirror that morning. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The chamber suddenly came alive with the sound of alarms. Red lights flashed, and a robotic voice echoed through the space. Unauthorized access. Security en route. Panic surged through him. He had to get out of there. He turned and ran back the way he came, the sound of his footsteps drowned out by the blaring alarms. When he reached the corridor, he skidded to a halt. Standing at the other end was the man from the bus, the one in the long coat and hat. David's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The man didn't respond. He simply raised a hand, and the world around David seemed to warp and twist. The corridor stretched impossibly long, the walls bending and rippling as though they were made of liquid. David felt himself being pulled forward, his vision blurring as the space collapsed around him. When he came to, he was back on the bus. The seats were empty, and the windows were dark. The only sound was the faint hum of the engine as the vehicle sped through an endless void. David sat frozen in his seat, the emptiness of the bus pressing in on him like a weight. Outside the window was nothing, just an infinite void, black and featureless. The hum of the engine was the only sound, steady and unchanging, as if the bus were gliding through the edge of existence itself. He turned his gaze to the front of the bus. The driver's seat was empty. The wheels sat still, unmoving, as the vehicle sped forward on its invisible path. David's hands gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles white. "What is this place?" he whispered, though no one was there to answer. He stood cautiously, his legs trembling as he moved down the aisle. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his own fear making it harder to move. He reached the front of the bus and stared at the empty seat. The controls were illuminated by a faint blue light, their surfaces covered in symbols and buttons he didn't recognize. For a moment, he considered trying to stop the bus, to pull a lever or press a button, but something told him it wouldn't make a difference. This vehicle was beyond his understanding, beyond his control. As he turned to head back to his seat, a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." David whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing at the back of the bus was the man in the long coat and hat. His face was still obscured by shadows, but his presence filled the space with a palpable tension. "Who are you?" David demanded, his voice shaking. The man didn't move. "I'm someone who's trying to fix what you've broken." David's brow furrowed. "I haven't broken anything. I don't even know what's going on." The man stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the floor. "You think this is random? That you're just some innocent passenger swept up in something beyond your control?" He stopped a few feet from David, his face finally becoming visible under the harsh interior lights. His features were sharp, angular, with piercing eyes that seemed to see through him. "This bus doesn't make mistakes," the man continued. "It brought you here for a reason." David took a step back, his mind racing. "I didn't ask for this. I was just going to class." "You're the anomaly," the man interrupted, his tone cold and matter-of-fact. "Your existence is misaligned. Every step you take, every decision you make, ripples out and distorts the timeline. The Nexus flagged you as a disruption." David's pulse quickened. "The Nexus? What are you talking about?" The man sighed, as though explaining something obvious to a child. "The Nexus is the heart of time itself. It maintains balance across dimensions, ensuring that reality flows as it should. But people like you, anomalies, create fractures. Those fractures spread, and if left unchecked, they can collapse entire timelines." David shook his head, backing away until his back hit the window. "That's impossible. I'm no one. I don't matter enough to break anything." The man tilted his head, studying him. "That's what makes you dangerous. It's always the ones who think they're insignificant who cause the most damage. Every choice you've made, every hesitation, every action you thought was meaningless. It's all added up to this." David's mind reeled. He tried to think of something, anything, that could explain how this was happening, but nothing made sense. He wasn't a scientist or a time traveler. He was just a student. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The man's expression hardened. "Now, you have two choices. You can step off this bus at the next stop and return to your life as it was before. Everything you've seen, everything you've experienced, will be erased. You'll wake up tomorrow with no memory of this place." David swallowed hard. "And the other option?" The man's eyes narrowed. "You stay. You embrace what you are and take responsibility for the chaos you've caused. But if you choose to stay, there's no going back. You'll become part of the Nexus, bound to its will, existing across all timelines at once." David's stomach twisted. "Bound to its will? What does that even mean?" "It means you won't be you anymore," the man said simply. "You'll become something else, a fragment of a greater whole. You'll lose your individuality, but you'll gain the power to mend the fractures you've created. David stared at the man, his mind spinning with the weight of the choice before him. How could he decide? How could he even trust what this stranger was telling him? The bus began to slow, its hum fading into silence as it came to a stop. Outside the window, the void was no longer empty. A platform had appeared, glowing faintly with the same blue light that illuminated the bus's controls. "This is your stop," the man said, gesturing toward the doors. "If you want to go back to your life, step off now. But if you want to take responsibility for what you've done, stay on board." David looked at the platform, then back at the man. Every instinct told him to leave, to step off the bus and forget this nightmare. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. He couldn't ignore what he'd seen, couldn't pretend it didn't matter. "I don't want to lose myself," he said, his voice trembling. The man nodded, a faint hint of understanding in his expression. "No one does. But sometimes, it's the only way to make things right." David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, the platform was gone. The bus was moving again, its hum returning as it sped into the void. The man returned to his seat, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't look at him. "Now, you wait. The Nexus will find you when it's ready." David sat back in his seat, his mind heavy with the weight of his decision. The void outside seemed to stretch on forever, but he knew he wouldn't be traveling alone. The bus seemed to glide endlessly through the void, its hum becoming a constant backdrop to the surreal journey. David sat in his seat, staring at the dark expanse outside the window. No stars, no horizon, just an infinite emptiness that felt as though it might swallow him whole. The man in the coat sat near the back, silent and motionless. His presence was unnerving, a constant reminder of the choice David had just made. The memory of the glowing platform lingered in his mind, a path not taken, a life he would never return to. "How long does this take?" David asked, breaking the silence. His voice sounded small, almost swallowed by the vastness around them. The man didn't respond immediately. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his head bowed slightly, as though deep in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "Time doesn't work here the way you're used to," he said. "It could be seconds. It could be years. The Nexus will summon you when it's ready." David frowned, frustration bubbling beneath his confusion. "The Nexus this, the Nexus that. What even is it? You talk about it like it's alive." The man raised his head, his sharp eyes fixing on David. "Because it is. The Nexus isn't just a thing. It's the center of everything. Time, space, reality. It's a living system, constantly balancing the threads of existence. And you," he trailed off, his gaze narrowing. "You've been disrupting it." David bristled. "You keep saying that, but I still don't understand. How could I possibly disrupt something like that? I'm just one person. I go to class, I take the bus, I don't—" "Every choice matters," the man interrupted, his voice cutting through David's protest. "Even the smallest decisions create ripples. Sometimes, those ripples cancel each other out, and the timeline stabilizes. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they grow and collide and twist into fractures that the Nexus can't repair on its own. That's when people like me step in." David leaned back in his seat, his thoughts churning. Every word the man said felt like another piece of a puzzle he didn't have the edges for. "So you're, what, some kind of time cop?" he asked, his tone tinged with skepticism. The man's lips curved into a faint smirk. "Something like that." Before David could ask another question, the bus began to slow. The hum of the engine deepened, and the windows filled with a soft, golden light. David turned to look outside, his breath catching in his throat. The void was gone. In its place was a sprawling structure that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It was made of interlocking rings and gears, each piece moving in perfect harmony with the others. The light emanating from the structure pulsed rhythmically, like the beating of a heart. "That's it," the man said, rising from his seat. "The Nexus." David stood, his legs unsteady as he approached the front of the bus. The doors slid open with a hiss, and a wave of warm air rushed inside. He hesitated, looking back at the man. "What happens when I step off?" The man's expression was unreadable. "You become part of it. You'll see the threads, feel the connections, and you'll understand." David swallowed hard. The thought of losing himself, of becoming something unrecognizable, filled him with dread. But he knew there was no turning back. He had made his choice. With trembling steps, he descended from the bus. The ground beneath his feet was smooth and cool, like polished glass. As he moved closer to the Nexus, the air around him seemed to vibrate with energy. Threads of light stretched from the structure, connecting to distant points he couldn't see. "Welcome, anomaly," a voice said, echoing all around him. David froze. The voice wasn't human. It was layered, resonant, as though 1,000 beings were speaking in unison. "You have chosen to become one with the Nexus," the voice continued. "You will exist across all timelines, mending fractures, restoring balance." David's heart pounded. "What happens to me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You will remain," the Nexus said, "but you will not be the same. Your consciousness will expand beyond individuality. You will perceive all possibilities, all outcomes. You will be a fragment of the whole." David's mind reeled at the thought. To see everything, to feel everything. Could he handle that? Would he even recognize himself? Before he could process the implications, the threads of light around him began to shift. One by one, they reached toward him, wrapping around his body like tendrils. They were warm, almost comforting, and yet he felt a strange sense of detachment, as though his body were no longer his own. Images flooded his mind. He saw himself in 1,000 different lives, an artist, a scientist, a wanderer. In one, he saved a child from drowning. In another, he walked away from a burning building, guilt etched across his face. Each version of himself felt real and yet distant, like watching a movie he had starred in but couldn't remember filming. The threads tightened, pulling him closer to the Nexus. The structure glowed brighter, its gears turning faster as the light enveloped him. "This is your purpose," the voice said, "to restore what has been broken." David closed his eyes, surrendering to the light. When he opened them again, he was no longer on the platform. He was everywhere and nowhere. His consciousness stretched across infinite timelines. He saw fractures in the threads of existence, moments of imbalance, choices that spiraled out of control. He reached out, not with his hands, but with his mind, and began to weave the threads back together. It was overwhelming at first, the sheer magnitude of it all threatening to consume him. But as he worked, he began to understand. Each thread was a life, each fracture a story. And though he was no longer David in the way he had once been, he felt a deep connection to the world he was mending. Time passed, though he no longer experienced it as humans did. He became a guardian of the Nexus, a silent force ensuring that reality held together. And yet, deep within the vastness of his new existence, a small part of him remained. A fragment of the boy who had boarded a bus one ordinary morning, unaware that his life was about to change forever. The nostalgic television. Maria was no stranger to solitude. At 74 years old, her days followed a predictable rhythm. mornings spent sipping tea by the window, afternoons organizing the same collection of photographs, and evenings filled with soft music or a book she'd already read countless times. Her small apartment in the heart of the city was a haven of quiet, filled with relics of a life lived fully but now distant. Old photographs, vinyl records, and a bookshelf brimming with memories. In the corner of her living room sat her television, a sleek Samsung Smart TV that her daughter had bought her 2 Christmases ago. It was a marvel of modern technology, capable of streaming anything Maria could imagine. But despite its convenience, it lacked the charm of her old Sony Trinitron, a bulky television that had been the centerpiece of her family's living room for decades. The Trinitron now languished in her attic, buried beneath years of forgotten items. It hadn't worked in over 20 years, but Maria had never mustered the will to throw it away. It was more than a piece of technology. It was a time capsule, a silent witness to movie nights with her late husband, Javier, and the laughter of her children as they crowded around it to watch cartoons on Sunday mornings. One cloudy afternoon, while tidying the attic, Maria found herself standing before the old television. Its surface was coated in dust, its once bright screen dull and lifeless. She hesitated, her hand resting on its curved top. Memories flooded back. Javier insisting on buying the best model available, their children fighting over the remote, the faint hum the television made when it was first turned on. Impulsively, Maria decided to bring it downstairs. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was nostalgia, or maybe she just wanted a connection to those simpler times. With some effort, she hauled the heavy set into her living room and placed it on a small table next to her modern television. Curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to plug it in. She didn't expect it to work. After all, it had been gathering dust for decades. But when she turned the knob to power it on, a faint hum emanated from within, followed by static on the screen. Maria froze, her heart skipping a beat. How was this possible? She leaned closer as the static began to resolve into an image. At first, it was blurry, like an old, poorly tuned broadcast. But slowly, the picture sharpened, and Maria gasped. The screen was showing her kitchen from 30 years ago. She recognized the wallpaper with its faded floral pattern, the wooden table where her family used to gather for meals. And there she was, her younger self, bustling around the kitchen with an energy she could barely remember. She was wearing an apron with tiny daisies printed on it, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Maria couldn't believe her eyes. This wasn't a recording. It couldn't be. She'd never owned a camera capable of capturing this kind of footage, let alone one positioned in her kitchen. But there it was, playing out in real time as though it were a live broadcast from the past. Her younger self turned toward the screen, and for a moment, Maria thought she was looking directly at her. She held her breath, her hands gripping the edge of the chair she had sunk into. But her younger self merely walked past, setting a plate of food on the table where Javier sat reading a newspaper. Tears welled in Maria's eyes. She hadn't seen Javier's face in so long. His kind eyes, the way he smiled when he spoke. It was all there, preserved on the screen. She watched as he folded the newspaper and leaned over to kiss her younger self on the cheek, the simple gesture filling her chest with a bittersweet ache. The scene played on for several minutes before the image began to fade. Maria reached out, as though she could physically stop it from disappearing, but the screen returned to static. She sat there in stunned silence, her mind racing to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The next day, Maria couldn't stop thinking about the television. She found herself drawn to it, unable to resist the temptation of turning it on again. This time, the static resolved into a different scene. It was a birthday party, her son's 8th birthday, to be exact. She recognized the cake she had spent hours decorating, the banner strung across the living room that read Feliz Cumpleaños, Daniel. The sound crackled to life, faint but clear enough to hear the laughter and chatter of her family. Her younger self was lighting the candles on the cake, while her children bounced excitedly around the table. Daniel blew out the candles, his cheeks puffed with air, and Maria could almost feel the warmth of that moment as though she were there again. But something strange happened this time. As the scene played out, her younger self looked up, her eyes locking onto the screen. Maria's heart skipped a beat. It was as though her younger self could see her, like the television was a two-way window. Then, the screen flickered, and a message appeared in blocky white text. "Do you wish to change this?" Maria leaned back in her chair, her breath catching in her throat. Change it? What did that mean? How could she change something that had already happened? Her hand hovered over the power knob, torn between fear and curiosity. After a long moment, she whispered, "Yes." The scene rewound itself in an instant, the movements of her younger self and her children playing backward like an old VHS tape. Then it paused and a new message appeared. "You may adjust one moment." Maria hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of how the day had unfolded. She had yelled at her daughter, Anna, for spilling soda on the carpet. It had been a small moment, but it had ruined Anna's mood for the rest of the party. "Don't scold her," Maria murmured, unsure if the television could understand her. The scene resumed. This time, when Anna spilled the soda, her younger self simply smiled and patted the girl's head, brushing the accident aside with a laugh. The party continued with joy and laughter, unmarred by the tension Maria remembered so vividly. When the scene faded and the screen returned to static, Maria sat in stunned silence. Had she really just altered the past? And if she had, what would it mean for the present? Maria couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. The moment she altered replayed in her mind, both as it had originally occurred and the new, softer version she had chosen. The memory of Anna's pouty face, upset over the scolding, had always lingered as a sour note in an otherwise joyous day. But now, with her intervention, Anna's laughter and smiles seemed to overwrite the sadness entirely. It felt impossible, absurd, even, and yet Maria had witnessed it with her own eyes. She spent the rest of the evening pacing her apartment, her thoughts running wild. What had the television done? Could it really change the past? And if so, what other moments could she revisit? The questions haunted her, refusing to let her rest. The next morning, Maria approached the television with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Her hands trembled as she turned the knob, the hum of the old set filling the room. For a moment, the screen remained static, and she feared that whatever had allowed her to alter the past was gone. But then the image began to form, and her breath caught. This time, it was the summer of 1989. The scene showed a beach, golden sand stretching into the distance. She saw herself younger, holding hands with Javier as they strolled along the shore. Their children, Daniel and Anna, were building a sandcastle nearby, their laughter carried by the ocean breeze. Maria sank into her chair, her heart swelling with nostalgia. She had forgotten how much she loved that day. It was one of the few vacations they had taken as a family, a brief escape from the struggles of work and finances. She watched as Javier leaned down to pick up a shell, handing it to their daughter, who squealed with delight. But as the scene continued, Maria noticed something she hadn't before. Javier's smile faltered for just a moment, his hand moving to clutch his chest. He quickly shook it off, waving away her younger self's concern. But the image stayed with Maria. She remembered that moment now, but only faintly. Javier had insisted it was nothing, a bit of fatigue, maybe, or the result of too much sun. But looking at it through the lens of hindsight, Maria couldn't shake the thought that it might have been an early warning of the heart condition that would take him years later. The screen flickered, and the familiar text appeared. "Do you wish to change this?" Maria's heart raced. Could she save him? Could she warn her younger self to insist he see a doctor? Her hand hovered over the knob, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of hope and fear. Yes, she whispered. The scene rewound, and the message changed. You may adjust one moment. Maria leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen. Tell him to get checked, she murmured, her voice trembling. Don't let him brush it off. The scene resumed. This time, her younger self didn't let Javier dismiss the pain. She took his hand, her expression firm, and insisted they go to a clinic when they returned from the trip. Javier hesitated, but eventually nodded, a small smile playing on his lips as he kissed her cheek. The screen faded, and Maria sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Had she just saved him? Would that change everything? But as the hours passed, nothing seemed different. Her apartment was the same, her belongings untouched. There was no sign that Javier had been restored to her life, no phone call or knock at the door. Maria's chest tightened with disappointment, the hope that had bloomed within her quickly fading. That night, as she lay in bed, she wondered if the television's power was more limited than she had thought. Perhaps it could change small moments, but not the larger currents of time. Still, she couldn't bring herself to stop trying. Over the next few days, Maria continued to use the television, each session revealing a new fragment of her past. She saw birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet evenings spent with her family. Each time the screen offered her the chance to change something, and each time, she chose carefully. She stopped her younger self from scolding Daniel for tracking mud into the house. She encouraged Anna to pursue art instead of giving up after a failed project. She even altered her own choices, nudging herself to be more patient, more present. But with each change, Maria began to notice something strange. The memories she had altered no longer felt like her own. They were brighter, happier, but they lacked the depth and complexity of the original moments. It was as though the changes had smoothed over the edges, leaving something that felt less real. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Maria noticed a small object on her coffee table, a pocket watch she didn't recognize. Its surface was engraved with intricate patterns, and the hands ticked steadily, though it didn't appear to be wound. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. Where had it come from? Had it always been there, and she simply hadn't noticed? The television's hum drew her attention back to the screen. This time, the scene was different. It showed her living room, just as it was now, but with one key difference. She wasn't alone. In the image, an older version of Daniel sat on the couch, his face creased with worry. He held a photograph in his hands, one of their family from years ago, and his expression was distant, as though lost in thought. Maria felt a pang of sadness. She hadn't seen her son in weeks. Their relationship had grown strained over the years, the result of misunderstandings and unspoken words. The text appeared again. Do you wish to change this? Maria hesitated. She wanted to repair her relationship with Daniel, but something about this moment felt different. The television's power had seemed like a gift at first, a way to fix the mistakes of her past. But now, she wasn't so sure. Each change she made seemed to create a distance between her and the life she had lived. No, she said, her voice steady. The screen flickered, and for the first time, the television seemed to respond. The text changed, the letters rearranging themselves into a new message. Why not? Maria stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Was the television questioning her? How could it even do that? She leaned forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the set. Because it's not my place, she whispered. I've already lived that life. It's not perfect, but it's mine. The screen went dark, and the room fell silent. Maria sat there for a long time, her reflection faintly visible in the blank screen. She felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the urge to turn the television back on. The television sat dark and silent for days, its presence in the living room a constant, quiet temptation. Maria avoided looking at it directly, but she felt its pull every time she passed by. The weight of her decisions hung heavy in the air, each choice she had made replaying in her mind. She had spent weeks revisiting the past, smoothing over regrets, altering moments of tension into memories of joy. But the question lingered: at what cost? The changes didn't bring the kind of closure she had hoped for. Instead, they left her with an unsettling emptiness, as if she were erasing not just the bad, but also the depth of her experiences. Her hands itched to turn the television back on, to see if the offer to change things still stood. But she resisted, trying instead to focus on the present. One morning, as Maria sat by the window sipping her tea, she noticed a letter slipped beneath her door. It was strange. She rarely received physical mail anymore. Most of her correspondence came through emails or phone calls. Setting her cup down, she rose and retrieved the envelope. It was plain, unmarked, with no return address. Inside, she found a single piece of paper with a simple message typed in crisp black letters. "The past is not a puzzle to be solved." Maria stared at the words, her heart pounding. Who had sent this? And how did they know? Her first instinct was to look toward the television, half expecting it to respond. But it remained still, its dark screen reflecting her face back at her. She folded the note and placed it on the table, her mind racing. The phrase echoed in her thoughts throughout the day, the truth of it sinking deeper with every hour. That evening, she found herself standing in front of the television. Her fingers hovered over the power knob, her heart torn between curiosity and hesitation. Finally, with a deep breath, she turned it on. The hum returned, low and steady, as the screen flickered to life. But this time, there was no static, no scene from her past. Instead, the screen displayed a single message: "Do you wish to continue?" Maria hesitated. She didn't know what the television meant by continue, but something told her this was more than just another chance to alter the past. She reached out and pressed her hand to the screen, whispering, "Yes." The room around her seemed to dissolve, the familiar walls of her apartment fading into a soft, golden light. For a moment, she felt weightless, as though she were floating in an infinite void. Then, slowly, the light coalesced into shapes and forms. She was no longer in her apartment. Maria found herself standing in a vast space, the ground beneath her feet smooth and reflective, like polished glass. Above her stretched a sky filled with shifting colors, hues of blue and gold swirling together in a mesmerizing dance. In the center of the space stood the television, but it was no longer the familiar Sony Trinitron she had known. This version was larger, more intricate, its frame adorned with glowing patterns that pulsed faintly, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The screen flickered, and a figure appeared. At first, it was blurry, its shape indistinct, but gradually it sharpened into an image of herself, her younger self, as she had been decades ago. The younger Maria smiled softly, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. "You've come a long way," she said, her voice echoing in the space. Maria took a step closer, her heart racing. "What is this place?" "This is the crossroads," her younger self replied, "where all the choices you've made converge. Every path you've taken, every moment you've changed, it's all led you here." Maria frowned. "I thought I was fixing things, making them better." Her younger self tilted her head, her expression gentle but firm. "Better for whom? Every change you made wasn't just about you. It rippled outward, touching lives in ways you couldn't see." The screen shifted, displaying fragments of scenes Maria didn't recognize. She saw a young boy crying in a park, his mother struggling to console him. She saw an older man sitting alone in a dimly lit room, his face etched with sorrow. She saw a couple arguing in a car, their voices rising as the tension boiled over. "These are the consequences of your changes," her younger self said. "Small moments that grew into something larger. You didn't just rewrite your past. You rewrote theirs." Maria's chest tightened. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to make things right." Her younger self smiled sadly. "The past isn't meant to be perfect. It's meant to be lived, with all its flaws and struggles. That's what makes it real." Maria turned away from the screen, her gaze falling to the reflective ground beneath her feet. Her reflection stared back at her, but it didn't feel like her own. It was fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror pieced together haphazardly. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The screen flickered, the image of her younger self dissolving into a swirl of light. A new message appeared. "Restore the balance?" Maria closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She thought of all the moments she had altered, the people she had tried to help, the memories she had tried to fix. None of it had brought her the peace she had hoped for. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. The television pulsed with light, the patterns on its frame glowing brighter. The space around her began to shift, the colors in the sky swirling faster until they became a blinding white. When the light faded, Maria was back in her living room. The television sat silent and dark, its screen reflecting the soft glow of the evening light filtering through the curtains. She looked down at her hands, half expecting to see some sign of what had happened, but everything appeared normal. The pocket watch was still on the coffee table, ticking steadily, its rhythm a quiet reminder of the choices she had made. Maria took a deep breath, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She knew now that the past wasn't something to be rewritten. It was something to be cherished, flaws and all. As she sat back in her chair, a faint smile crossed her lips. The television remained silent, but she felt no urge to turn it on again. The memories it had shown her would always be a part of her, but the life she had lived, the real, imperfect life, was enough. The days that followed were strangely peaceful for Maria. The television remained off, its once irresistible pull now replaced by a quiet understanding. The hum of its power was no longer a presence in her living room, and the glow of its screen no longer bathed the walls in flickering light. For the first time in weeks, Maria felt as though her life had been returned to her. Not the altered, smoothed-over version she had tried to create, but the messy, imperfect, beautiful life she had truly lived. She spent her mornings tending to her plants, the sunlight streaming through her kitchen window as she hummed old songs under her breath. The small herbs and flowers in their clay pots felt more vibrant somehow, as though the air around her carried a new energy. Her evenings were quieter now, too, filled with the crackle of her vinyl records and the gentle rhythm of her knitting needles clicking together. The pocket watch, however, remained on her coffee table. Its intricate engravings caught the light whenever she passed by, and its steady ticking became a comforting sound in the stillness of her home. She didn't know where it had come from or why it had appeared, but she felt no urgency to question it. One evening, as Maria prepared for bed, she glanced at the watch again. The hands were frozen, pointing to an exact time, 3:14 a.m. For a moment, she wondered if it was broken, but as she leaned closer, she noticed something peculiar. The glass face of the watch was faintly illuminated, and within the glow, she could see tiny symbols etched into the surface. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they looked eerily similar to the patterns she had seen on the television screen in the otherworldly space. A chill ran down her spine. Was it possible that the watch was somehow connected to the television? Or to the nexus she had encountered in that surreal crossroads? She hesitated, her hand hovering over the watch. The temptation to pick it up was strong, but a part of her feared what might happen if she did. After a moment, she pulled her hand back and turned away. Whatever mysteries the watch held, she wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. That night, Maria dreamed of the Nexus. The vast, glowing structure loomed in her mind, its threads of light weaving an intricate tapestry of moments and decisions. She saw her younger self again, standing at the center of it all, her eyes filled with quiet wisdom. "Are you happy now?" her younger self asked. Maria nodded, her heart heavy but certain. "I think so. I'm learning to be." The younger Maria smiled, her form dissolving into the light. When Maria woke the next morning, the world felt different. Not in any tangible way. Her apartment was the same, the street below her window unchanged, but there was a stillness, a clarity that she hadn't felt in years. She sat by the window with her tea, watching the city stir to life, and for the first time, she felt truly present. Later that day, she decided to call her son. Daniel's voice on the other end of the line was cautious at first, as though he wasn't sure why she was reaching out. Their relationship had been strained for years, the result of misunderstandings and unspoken resentment that neither of them had known how to address. "I was just thinking about you," Maria said, her voice warm, "and I realized it's been too long since we talked." There was a pause, and then Daniel chuckled softly. "Yeah, it has. How are you, Mom?" The conversation flowed more easily than she had expected. They spoke about small things, his work, her garden, a new book she had been reading. But beneath the surface, Maria felt a connection beginning to rebuild. After they hung up, Maria sat in her chair, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The call hadn't fixed everything, but it was a start. The pocket watch ticked softly on the coffee table. Its hands still frozen at 3:14 a.m. Maria glanced at it, her thoughts drifting to the paths she had walked, the moments she had altered, and the lessons she had learned. The past wasn't a puzzle to be solved, but a story to be lived, with all its triumphs and mistakes woven together. As the sun set and the apartment grew quiet, Maria reached for the watch. This time, she didn't hesitate. She held it in her hand, feeling the cool metal against her skin, and watched as the faint glow beneath the glass began to pulse. The symbols etched into the face shimmered, and for a brief moment, Maria felt a familiar sensation. The weightlessness, the warmth, the sense of standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. But this time, the feeling didn't overwhelm her. She smiled, placing the watch back on the table. Whatever mysteries it held, whatever connections it might have to the television or the Nexus, she was content to let them be. Her life was here, in the present, and she was finally ready to live it. The television remained silent, its screen dark. The pocket watch ticked softly in the quiet room, its glow fading until only the steady rhythm of time remained. And Maria, at last, felt at peace.